Here are some of the worst cases of mistaken identity. Number 6. Father Pagano versus the Gentleman Bandit. Back in 1978, someone robbed 5 businesses in Wilmington, Delaware. Or maybe, in this case, we'll say someone relieved 5 businesses of their resources, because I'm sure that's how the Gentleman Bandit would have described his actions. This guy got his nickname because he was very polite and apologetic during his crimes. When someone gave police a description of the super nice bandit and released a sketch of the suspect, it led them to Father Bernard Pagano. He was at the time a 53-year-old assistant pastor at a Catholic church in Cambridge, Maryland. Not 1, not 2, not 3, but 7 witnesses confirmed that he was the Gentleman Bandit who committed all the crimes. I mean, if you think about who'd probably be most likely to apologize for stealing, an assistant pastor would have to be up there, so I don't blame the logic there. Father Pagano was charged with 5 counts of armed robbery. However, considering that the guy was pretty much a life coach for many people in his community, they refused to believe that he could have been guilty for the acts, no matter how gentlemanly it was done. So Pagano's defense team started an investigation, and they found Roland Klauser, a former postal worker. Since Klauser was truly quite the gentleman, he felt so guilty over the idea of a priest taking the fall for his crimes that he staged even more robberies after Pagano's arrest, hoping to somehow prove to the police they had arrested the wrong person. You know what? That isn't the right move, but it isn't the wrong move either. To be honest, that wasn't actually a bad idea at all. Too bad it didn't work. When Father Pagano continued to be locked up, Klauser finally came forward and confessed his crimes, and all charges against Bernard Pagano were dismissed. Number 5. Ralph Alsman versus John Dillinger. John Dillinger was one of America's most well-known and infamous criminals who did his work back in the 30s. Dillinger was accused of robbing 24 banks and 4 police stations, among other activities. Seriously though, who robs police stations? It's pretty bad luck when you look exactly the same as one of the most famous gangsters in the US. Ralph Alsman was a regular guy who didn't find joy in robbing banks. As if the obvious normal physical resemblances between them weren't enough, Alsman also had a mole next to one eye, a scar on his left wrist, and a cleft chin too. Those were features Dillinger had as well. They really helped to complete the "I'm John Dillinger" look. Are we sure these two weren't the same guy? Since Alsman lived only 54 miles from Dillinger's hometown of Mooresville, Indiana, Alsman was easily mistaken for the infamous outlaw. In fact, Alsman was mistaken for Dillinger so often that he got arrested 17 times in total. Alsman often underwent stressful interrogation sessions to convince authorities he was not Dillinger. Poor guy got paranoid that someone would shoot him before he proved his real identity, and we don't blame him. He only finally found peace when Dillinger was ultimately taken down by federal agents. Number 4. Peter Hampkin versus Italian police. Imagine yourself doing your job at a bar in Liverpool, England, and one day you get arrested by Italian police because you're their main suspect for a murder case. That's exactly what happened to British bartender Peter Hampkin. In their search for the suspect for a murder, Italian police requested a search of the British DNA database. They found Hampkin's DNA as a match for evidence found at the scene of the crime back in Italy. However, the problem is that Hampkin had never, ever gone to Italy before. Couldn't they have just looked at his travel records? I guess if you're a professional assassin, you'd have false documents, but then again, do professional assassins pretend to work at a bar? Still, Hampkins had to spend 20 days in jail until they performed another, more exhaustive DNA test which proved his innocence. Contrary to popular belief, DNA tests aren't as accurate as everyone thinks. 99.9% of the DNA from any two people will be identical, but the 0.1% of DNA sequences that vary in everyone is what makes each person unique. It's easy to tell if DNA from 2 samples don't match, but a match doesn't always mean that samples came from the same person. There's always a small chance that 2 different people's genetic markers could be the same, especially if they're related. To reduce the chance of error, scientists test more than 1 genetic marker. The more identical markers there are in 2 samples, the more accurate the test. However, testing more markers takes more time and is more expensive. Forensic DNA tests usually examine 6 to 10 markers. In the US and the UK, 13 markers are considered a match, but in other European countries that number varies, and European countries don't all follow the same rules. The Italian police department that did the test to find Hampkin only looked at 6 markers, which of course wasn't accurate enough. In this case, this led them to a man that's never ever been in their country before. Number 3. Carlos DELUNA versus Carlos Hernandez. Spending a decade or two in jail probably isn't that bad compared to the case of Carlos DELUNA, who went on death row for a crime he didn't commit. His innocence was determined after it was too late, but this case isn't quite as clear-cut as it seems. DELUNA was arrested and convicted of a crime involving a gas station attendant in Corpus Christi, Texas. However, DELUNA insisted he was innocent and that another man named Carlos Hernandez had committed the crime instead. DELUNA took the stand in his own defense and testified that he was with his two sisters when Carlos Hernandez approached them. Although DELUNA didn't originally recognize Hernandez after talking to him, he realized that they had known each other as kids. DELUNA and Hernandez decided to go to a bar located directly across the street from the gas station. Hernandez told DELUNA that he was going over to the gas station to buy something, so DELUNA waited at the bar. DELUNA began wondering why Hernandez was taking so long, so he stepped outside to see what was going on. DELUNA could see from across the street that Hernandez was, let's call it, engaged with the gas station attendants. DELUNA decided to leave the bar because he was worried that people might say he was involved with Hernandez. When DELUNA heard sirens, that's when he started running and decided to hide. Police found DELUNA hiding a few blocks away underneath a parked truck. Despite being February, DELUNA had on no shoes or shirt and was lying in a puddle of water. The police pulled him out and found that he had a black wallet containing two $1 bills in his rear pocket and a wad of crumpled up bills totaling $149 in the front pocket of his pants. DELUNA testified that his shirt was ripped clean from his body while climbing over a fence, and the wadded up bills in his pocket were from 2 recent paychecks. Despite testifying his story in court, people that mattered didn't believe him. His innocence, however, became more and more likely when a Columbia University law professor and his team of students decided to do research on the case. They concluded that the state of Texas executed the wrong man. According to law professor James Lieberman, the police didn't pursue other leads. They didn't have concrete evidence linking DELUNA to the crime, and DELUNA had a very weak defense. Despite a crime scene filled with plenty of DNA from the gas station attendant, DELUNA didn't have anything linking him to the gas station. Supposedly, there was evidence that Carlos Hernandez did the crime, but police ignored all of the potential evidence. During the trial, the prosecution called Hernandez a phantom because DELUNA was unable to identify Hernandez from all the known Carlos Hernandezes on file. The prosecution had branded Hernandez as a figment of DELUNA's imagination. The Columbia University team, however, rather easily discovered extensive details about the mysterious Carlos Hernandez. They found that Hernandez was a career criminal, living in the same neighborhood as DELUNA and had a vast criminal history. The Columbia team found people who knew Hernandez and said he bragged to them about letting DELUNA take the fall. Despite all the facts, Corpus Christi police still maintained that DELUNA was the person who committed the crime. What do you think? Was DELUNA innocent or guilty? Number 2, Richard Jones versus Richard Amos. If you think you have a bad day, then listen to this story about a Missouri man who spent nearly 17 years in jail until his doppelganger and real perpetrator were discovered. It all started when Richard Jones was accused of mugging a woman in a Walmart parking lot in 1999. However, even though he kept denying the crime and there was no DNA evidence, fingerprints, or any other physical evidence that linked him to the crime, Richard Jones was still sentenced to 19 years for the mugging. Prosecutors only used eyewitnesses' testimonies to convict Jones. However, once he was in jail, a lot of other inmates mistook him for another prisoner who looked just like him. Oddly enough, that prisoner even had the same first name. So Jones went and told 2 legal interns at the Midwest Innocence Project assigned to his case about the rumors of another guy who looked just like him. To make a long story short, it turned out that not only did the other guy look almost exactly the same as Jones, but he also lived close to the crime scene. Jones's doppelganger, Richard Amos, used to live with his mother in Kansas City, Kansas, near the Walmart where the crime occurred. Richard Jones lives across the state line in Kansas City, Missouri. Kansas Department of Corrections records show Amos had been in and out of prison for years. Obviously, he denied the allegations, but he wasn't officially charged for the crime anyways. Soon after the discovery of the new evidence, Jones was a free man. The perfect storm of detective work, along with 2 men who pretty much looked like twins, led to an unfortunate 17-year prison term. Really, if you think about it, if Jones had just changed one thing about his look, such as no cornrows or no goatee, he would have had 17 years of extra life. The happy ending is that Jones ended up getting $1.1 million from the mistaken identity. Number 1. Will West versus William West. Back before today's much more sophisticated methods of identification were invented, police used something called the Bertillon method to prove someone's identity. That method included a lot of measurements. They'd measure the size and shape of different parts of someone's body and face. The Bertillon method worked pretty well for the time, or better said, it worked great until 1903. The fault in the method was discovered when a guy named Will West got arrested for a minor crime. While being interrogated, they asked him if he'd ever been in trouble with the law before. He answered no, but they checked his measurements and thought he was lying because, come on, back then it was impossible to beat the Bertillon method. So of course, he ended up being charged for lying as well. Will West obviously wasn't lying about never being in trouble with the law before. It turned out that a convicted criminal who matched Will West's measurements was already imprisoned. Weirdly enough, his doppelganger was in that same prison. To make things even more ridiculously complicated, both of them had the same first name and last name. Authorities had major trouble telling the two Wests apart because, let's be for real here, who on earth wouldn't? One was serving a life sentence for murder, while the other was in for a much lesser charge. Luckily, the prison warden heard about the fingerprint method, which was considered new at the time, and they were finally able to tell both guys apart. Here's what's next.